So we're going to pick up with this periods that we ended with on Friday, and we technically ended at the end of Reconstruction. So we're picking up with what we call the Gilded Age, right? And what I want to think about is the essay that you guys had to write on the mock exam, which was essay question 3, right? And essay question 3 asked you about technological advancement from 1865 to 1900, okay? We're not quite going to 1900, but we're certainly going in the direction of the dawn of the 20th century. And so I want us to think about what would that question entail, right? And what does the period itself entail? Let's start with the rise of big business, okay, coming out of the Civil War, and then we'll get to technology, we'll get to the politics of the period, and we'll discuss migration and the environment too, okay? So during the Civil War, we have to think about this for just a moment. And that's the reason why I wanted to go back to 1861 with this half of the period, is because during the Civil War, politically, the Lincoln administration was much more progressive oriented than what we ever give it credit for being, right? In some ways, this is replicated by the way the American administration under FDR and later Truman, right, acted during the Second World War. For example, during the Second World War, there was this harnessing and mobilization of American industry during the war. But there was this idea that you would continue feeding that after World War II, right? That you didn't want another Great Depression to occur. So you also the government began massively investing in people with the GI Bill of 1944, creating the International Monetary Fund, right, at the Bretton Woods Conference and the World Bank, right? There were all of these elements at the end of the Second World War that were literally put into America not having to deal with another global recession, right, at the end of that war. Well, at the end of the Civil War, we do something quite different in a way, but in philosophy that's very similar. At the beginning of the war in 1862, there are 3 major acts that are passed. The first is the Pacific Railways Act. And the Pacific Railways Act gave us the infrastructure through government grants and subsidies to the railroad companies to build the transcontinental railroad system, which literally, in this period of American history, from the end of the Civil War to the dawn of the 20th century, it's the railroad system that's really the integral hub to American economic, or as we would say, industrial growth during this period. The second major act that's passed is the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act opened up the West essentially for settlement, offering government-granted land to people who were willing to buy it for a discounted fee. Third, the act that is seldom mentioned but very important. As Western populations grew, as the mining industry grew in the West, and that had happened on the eve of the Civil War, but certainly is going to expand after the Civil War. It's important it's going to expand after the Civil War. The Morrill Land Grant Act became really important in establishing state colleges and universities across the West. Texas A&M University is just one example of many of the state colleges that's established in the West during this period through the use of the Morrill Act. So think about it for a moment. If you're the federal government, during the Civil War, you're partnering with business for the first time to do what? Build the weapons of war. In other words, you've already established a relationship between corporate America and the federal government. Second, you've established a relationship that's going to allow for the building of the infrastructure that will give you a modern American industrial state. Third, you're putting people into the West for the first time. You're enticing them into the West. Now we know that's going to cause conflicts with the Native Americans. We know there's going to be tremendous environmental consequences because you're doing this, right? But we also know something else. This is going to lead to the rise of commercial agriculture and its growth. That too is one of the, for us, one of the pivotal engines for the industrial growth of the United States in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the early 20th. The other thing that we know that's going to happen is you're beginning the process of building an infrastructure for education in the West for the first time. And so now all of a sudden you're doing what? You're educating the growing population of a part of the country, and this is all through what? This is all through the use of the power of the federal government during the Civil War and coming out of the Civil War, right? It's interesting to me, we make the association, and I think wrongly, that we make the association that the federal government is only involved in the initiatives behind the process of Reconstruction. I think we have to think about that a little differently, right? That it's really the federal government that in many respects is behind the growth of American industrial power that occurs after the Civil War as well. It has a hand in that process, right? Now, the other thing that we have to mention, of course, is that in rebuilding the country after the Civil War and beginning with infrastructure, right, we're going to have several key industries that arise during this period, right? So, the first, of course, is going to be the railroad industry, and from to 1869, when the transcontinental railroad system is being built, we also see that interregional rail networks are being built during this period. Why is that? Excuse me. It's to facilitate trade with ports along the Pacific coast on the one hand, but it's also much more so to deliver resources from western mining towns to the growing industrial base in the east. It's also used to facilitate the growth of the food industry as well. At the end of the Civil War, cattle drives from states like Texas, for example, provide us with the first example of commercial agriculture and the use of a new technology through the power and growth of the transcontinental railroad system. And that new technology, of course, is important to our daily lives today. That's the technology of refrigeration, right? Refrigerated railroad cars allowed for meat. They allowed for food products, dairy products, so just as an example, right, to be transferred to different places across the country easily, right? This was a part of the growth of the market economy coming out of the Civil War. It had existed before the Civil War, but now what are you able to do? You're able to take refrigerated foods and ship them to parts of the country, from one part of the country, to the next. Second, the mining industry also fueled industrial growth, right? You're taking raw materials out of the West to use, usually to do what? To make, for example, items like steel, okay? You're taking iron ore from western mines, places like Minnesota, for example, and you're shipping them to places like Pennsylvania. Now, that also means that we have to have new technologies that are developed, right? So, if the government is investing in railroads, railroads are providing food for American consumers across the country, and the mining industry is fueling industrial growth, right? We also have to realize that the next new industry that's going to come along, and these two industries are somewhat competitive with one another, are the oil and steel industries, right? It's interesting because if you were alive during this period and you were living in a typical home, your home would have been lit by kerosene lamps, right? Before that, it would have been lit by whale oil, most likely, okay, in lamps in your home. So the petroleum industry becomes very important, not because of combustion engines and things of that nature, but because electricity has not come along, and it's not, we don't, even though we know what electricity is by the 1860s, there's no practical use for it in a home application. So most homes are lit by kerosene during this period, which meant that what? It meant that the oil industry, right, was an industry in its infancy during this period. The industry that really comes of age during this period is the steel industry, right? And what we have to understand is there's a technological innovation that led to that, and that's, of course, is Henry Bessemer's process that's created or developed in England in the late 1850s. Quite simply, the Bessemer process allowed for entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie to harness this idea that what we can do now is mass produce high-grade steel. And when we mass produce high-grade steel, what can we do? Well, we can build bridges that span navigable rivers so that the railroads can actually now go anywhere, right? And that does what? It speeds up transportation. It speeds up the facilitation of goods and services moving across the country. And it also makes that transport safer, right? But there's another dimension to this. With the rise of big industry and industrial growth in the eastern parts of the country, and with the growth of the transcontinental railroad system into the west, we were drawing in immigrants from all over the world. In fact, there are so many immigrants coming in from China in particular after the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864. There's so many Chinese immigrant workers who are coming into the country after 1865 to work on the transcontinental railroad system that it's the first ban actually on this day, May 6th in 1882, to be applied to an immigrant group was the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So it's really interesting to us. There's this time, this period of tremendous industrial growth across the country. On the one hand, that would sound good, but on the other hand, you're doing what? You're bringing in a lot of immigrants, particularly in eastern states. You're bringing them into industries from places like Central Europe, for example. Immigrants came from Italy, they came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they came from the Russian Empire during this period, and roughly from 1870 to 1920. More immigrants come into the country during that 50-year span of time than any other in American history. While there is a law excluding the number of Chinese people, banning the Chinese people by 1882 that can come into the country, it's fair to say that there was a tremendous amount of nativist sentiment that developed in American life after the 1870s. Don't equate the Ku Klux Klan of the Reconstruction era with the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s. Do equate the nativist sentiments of the 1920s to some extent to the nativist sentiments of people who were immigrants who were taking the lowest paying industrial jobs, right, and taking those away from the white working class Americans who were already here. The nativist sentiment of the 1870s and 1880s has that strain to it. But there's also the fear of socialism, there's a fear of anarchists, there's a fear of groups that are coming into this country that are bringing new and radical ideas. Probably for us, right, with oil and steel and the railroad industry growing, one of the things to understand is that by the late 1870s and into the 1880s, we begin to see new innovations by people like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, for example, who are creating or developing inventions such as the telephone and the light bulb, right, with Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone, and the light bulb with Edison. And later the use of alternating current, which will, with the development of the electric motor by Nikola Tesla, which would allow eventually for the electrification of homes and businesses. This doesn't start until the late 19th century and early 20th century, so it's a little beyond the period that we are in, but we're seeing this happening at the end of this period. And the other thing that we're seeing that's happening at the end of this period is the first, what I call investment banking. One of the first patents ever issued by the U.S. government was for the cotton gin in 1794, right? And ever since then, American inventors, inventions and innovations, right, were not necessarily a big business except for the patent holder themselves. By the 1880s and the 1890s, we have investment bankers, people like J.P. Morgan, who are literally investing in inventors. Why? Simple. So take someone like Thomas Edison for just a moment, right? Somebody who invents hundreds of new products that can be used in American life. Everything from the light bulb to the phonograph, right? To the first film machines, okay? So think about that for just a moment. If I own the patent for all of those innovations, then every time companies market them, I make money off of that, right? The first person to really think about doing that in a very broad way was J.P. Morgan. Morgan's a banker. He's not an inventor. He's not an entrepreneur. He's not like Rockefeller, who essentially buys out all of his competition and creates a monopoly in the oil industry. He's not like Carnegie, who creates this vertically oriented steel industry, right? Vertical integration meant that I would buy all the facets of production for a product, so therefore I would own everything that would be needed to make that product. Horizontal integration means I'm buying out all of my competition, so therefore I'm the only person who can market a product. JP Morgan's very different. He's not doing either one of those things in essence. He's investing in companies, but more than that, he's investing in people, right? And every time I invest in people and I invest in companies and they make money, I do too, right? It's really the forerunner for what you guys think of today. It's not just investment banking, but investing in stock. So when Apple creates a product and all of you guys buy into it, you're doing what JP Morgan was doing, right? The only difference between you and JP Morgan was buying out Apple. And then when Apple produced all these products, they were making money for JP Morgan, okay? Now for us, it's interesting, right? Because when we think about this for just a moment, and we think about the number of immigrants that are coming into the country from Central and Eastern Europe, and of course people who are coming from East Asia as well, we have to think about what that does to American politics during the period. So American cities grew dramatically during this period. And we saw dramatic urban growth because of the rise of big business. We also saw the rise of labor unions during this period for the first time. We saw workers who had to deal with the economic conditions of this period for the very first time. I did not put this up here, but it's well worth putting up here, and so I want you guys to add this into your notebook if you would. There are two major recessions during this period that affect American workers tremendously. And the first, we're going to put labor unions here, but we're also going to put financial panics. And there are two of them. And they roughly occur 20 years apart from one another. There's a panic in 1873 and a panic in 1893. The panic in 1873 occurred because the railroad system was overbuilt. Okay. The panic in 1893 occurred essentially because of bank failures. Okay. It occurred because of currency issues. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about currency being such a big issue in the early 1890s when we talk about the rise of the populist movement, right? The panic in 1893 had a tremendous impact on Americans psychologically. But the panic in 1873 did too, right? How? Well, for the very first time, American companies, American businesses, and the railroad companies employed more people than any other during this period out of all of the big businesses. Why? Because railroads facilitate the growth of every business. Everybody uses them. You use them to travel. You use them to get your freight. If you're a business, you use them to ship your freight from every part of the country, right? So the entire economy is tied to this system, essentially, right? But when there's a financial panic and it involves this system, now all of a sudden what do we find? Well, we find that workers are being laid off by the thousands, okay? And so now all of a sudden you have people who cannot spend money back into the economy because they're not making any money, because the railroads themselves were not making any money. The other thing that we saw, this occurred in the steel industry, it occurred in the agricultural services industry in 1886, but major strikes occur during this period. The labor union movement grows out of the Panic of 1873, okay? You have two organizations, one of which is still with us, right? The first is the Knights of Labor. It's established in 1869 before the Panic of 1873. But the Knights of Labor was essentially for skilled workers, okay? By the 1880s, by 1886, there's a much more powerful organization. The American Federation of Labor is established. Why are the labor unions important? Well, they're important for really two reasons. There's a huge railroad strike in 1877. There's another huge strike in 1886, the Haymarket riot, Chicago, right? And there's another huge strike in 1892, the Homestead Steel strike at Carnegie Steel Plant in Pennsylvania. And then there's a final massive strike in 1894, the Pullman strike. This is all before Theodore Roosevelt in 1902 begins the process of actually giving us a settlement between labor and management. I know this is a long story, but we're going to get to the point here in a moment. Okay, we're going to tie this together here in a second. What I need us to understand about the labor union movement is simply this, right? Every time there was a strike, most Americans, especially as they're related to the railroad industry, because Americans depend on that industry, most Americans side with the companies. They do not side with the workers. Next, number two, it's usually the federal government. In almost every case, beginning in 1877 through the Pullman strike in 1894, it's the federal government that shuts down the strikes. And in almost every case, the strikers destroy property. And also, there are people killed in almost every case. So the strikes become violent, and violence is used to put them down. So the labor union movement begins to be painted in the public mindset as a violent one. Now, what's the major goal of the labor union movement? The major goal is to do what? It's to achieve better working conditions in America's growing factories. Now, we are pre-assembly line during this period, but we're not pre-poor factory conditions. We're not pre-poor wages for most workers. And most American workers, of course, are immigrants during this period, or poor working white class individuals during this period, right? So we have to think the labor union movement's also associated with what? Immigrants and radical ideas. So therefore, most of the American public fears the labor unions. But in some cases, American politicians want to take advantage of them, okay? And this leads to what we think of as the rise of political machines in major cities. Tammany Hall is probably the best example of this in New York City, where we have corrupt politicians like William Marcy or Boss Tweed, right? Essentially, this is how political machines would work. So if you were a political machine, you would appeal to working class immigrant voters. You would try to get their votes by doing what? Trying to get them a job in one of these large factories of the period, for example. You would try to get them what? Somewhere to live, usually in one of the horrifying tenements that people lived in, and whole families lived in during this period. But yet, what would you do? You would give them the opportunity, right, to step into America's working class. You give them the opportunity for a place to live, even though those conditions would have been horrific during the period. But in exchange for that, what would you do? Well, you would get their votes, right? The other thing that you would do is this. You would promise that you would create public works projects. You would build public buildings that would provide services for people such as this. In other words, you would build courthouses, you would build post offices or things of that nature, right? And what would you do if you were a political machine? Well, you would employ people in building them, but you would overbuild for you would over budget for the project. Why would you over budget for projects? Tammany Hall did this under Boss Tweed several times, so that you could take the kickback and you could get all the money skimmed off the top for over budgeting, right? In other words, they were quite corrupt. They were not just corrupt in terms of the way that they dealt with people politically, but they were just as corrupt in the way that they dealt with the city taxpayer dollars and how they used that money as well. Okay?